I, 28F, have been married to Ray, 30M, for 4 years and have known him for 8. He introduced me to his family after we'd been together for 6 months, and while most of his family had liked me, his mother did not. My mother-in-law, Ruth, 56F, has always been kind of weird around me. She doesn't like me, and I've known that for a long time, but she'd usually just ignore me and try not to talk to me as much as she could whenever I came by. Last week, I was home alone and she knew that because Ray was away on a business retreat. It was one of those social detox retreats where you're not allowed to have your phones or talk to anyone else unless it's an absolute emergency. So all of us knew that we wouldn't be able to reach him for a few days. On the 4th day of his being gone, Ruth dropped by my house, and with her came 2 kids I'd never seen before. They were both under 10 years old but didn't say a word to me for as long as they were here. In fact, saying that Ruth dropped by would be incorrect. She rang the bell many times before I finally opened the door, literally raged into the house with 2 kids in tow, and then left in an equally angry way just as she'd come. I tried to get her to stop so I could talk to her and get some answers about what the hell she was doing, but with no luck because she'd taken off in her car before I could ask her anything. So I was left with the 2 random kids who refused to look at me, talk to me, or even acknowledge that I was in the house with them. I tried talking to them to find out who their parents were, but they were as good as nonverbal to me, so I gave up. My first instinct had been to call CPS, but I didn't do that because I had a nagging feeling that these kids were definitely related to my husband's family somehow. I couldn't place it, but both the kids looked familiar to me for some reason while I was trying to figure out why they seemed related. So that's why I didn't call CPS and instead chose to call my husband. I told the receptionist at their resort that I needed to speak to my husband urgently, and within a few minutes, I was on the phone with him, explaining everything that had happened. He told me he'd be home within a few hours and hung up, so then, I was alone with the kids until he came back. The resort they'd been staying in wasn't too far away from the city, and it just took him 4 hours to drive back home. For those 4 hours, those 2 kids consciously avoided looking at me, but I kept watching over them like a hawk. I didn't even go to the washroom for those 4 hours because I wasn't about to let those kids out of my sight at any cost whatsoever. As soon as Ray came back home, I took him aside and explained how the kids weren't speaking to me at all and how strangely they'd been whispering among themselves the entire time that they'd been here, careful enough to not let me overhear a word. This was very weird and secretive behavior from 2 kids, so I was feeling very paranoid and was on the verge of calling CPS, but Ray stopped me and told me that he'd called his mother over to explain, so whatever we needed to do, we could do after we confronted Ruth. I'd been trying to get through to Ruth the entire time I was at home, but she'd been ignoring all my calls. However, when Ray had called her, half an hour before he reached home, she'd answered and had told him that she'd come over and explain in a while. So after around an hour, Ruth arrived once more, and this time she had a lot of other people with her too. She'd arrived with Ray's entire family, my father-in-law, Ray's older brother, 32M, and his wife. I didn't understand why she'd come with an army of her own, and the others looked just as surprised as I felt. Nevertheless, Ray did confront his mother and asked about the kids. The kids were in the room with us and were literally cowering in fear and nervousness. They were trying their best to make themselves smaller and less noticeable, and I could tell that it was Ruth who was having that effect on them. When Ray asked his mom whose kids these were, she said that they were mine without missing a beat, and I was like, what? Because of course, these weren't my kids. Ray and I had decided to remain child-free for a few years, and if we changed our mind later, we'd just adopt. That had always been the deal. So I was shocked at Ruth's allegation, and so was the rest of the family. Ray told her to cut it out because obviously, we thought she was joking, but she doubled down on what she said and started off with some completely fictional story. Apparently, 3 weeks ago, she'd been contacted by some random man who told her that I was his ex-girlfriend. I'd been dating this guy for years and even had 2 kids with him during the course of our relationship, but once I got married, I cut him off and abandoned those kids as well before ghosting him. Now that he'd found me after several years of stalking, he'd tried to contact me, but I just blocked him again, so he'd been left with no other option but to contact my family, and that happened to be Ruth. He'd supposedly dropped the kids off at her place, and she, in a fit of rage, had dropped them off at mine so she could reveal to everyone that I'd been a cheater and a liar all along. While she was speaking, I was literally at a loss for words and just kept staring at her with my mouth wide open, and she went on concocting some nonsense. After she was done talking, she told Ray that since I already had kids now, we had to get custody of them and make sure we raised them well because the dad didn't want them anymore. Ray refused to believe her and told her to take the kids and go because he knew she'd been lying all along, but unfortunately, the rest of the family wasn't convinced. They did think that my mother-in-law was telling the truth and so insisted that we take care of them. Or maybe they did know that Ruth was lying but just didn't want to take up the responsibility of raising 2 random kids, and so they were pushing them onto us. There was a lot of shouting and yelling during the argument that came next, and eventually, Ray told them that we'd keep the kids with us for just a day for their sake, but after that, if Ruth didn't come and take them, then he'd call CPS. All this time, the kids were in the room with us, but as soon as CPS was mentioned, they ran to another room and somehow managed to lock themselves in while screaming in terror that they didn't want anyone to come take them away. My in-laws took that opportunity to leave us with the kids, and we spent the next half an hour trying to calm them down and convince them that nobody would come and take them away. They'd finally spoken to us, so at least that was an improvement, and after a while, they opened the door too, and it was clear that they'd been crying because their eyes were all red and teary. So we consoled them, put them to bed in the guest room, and went to sleep ourselves in our bedroom. We'd had a long tiring day and we were confused as hell as to what was going on here. Ray and I didn't even talk much before going to bed because we were that tired. It was not until the next morning that Ray and I discussed what to do next with the kids. We couldn't take care of them forever because that had never been in the cards anyway, but we couldn't call CPS either because apparently they were terrified of that idea. While we were brainstorming, Ray said something about how it would help so much if there was some proof that Ruth had brought the kids here. Finally, when he said that, I was reminded of the security footage from the cameras that I'd installed outside. In the panic and hubbub of the previous day, I'd completely forgotten about the security cameras and that I could actually use that footage to prove that Ruth had brought the kids here. To be honest, we've never had cause to use the cameras, so we'd forgotten about them, but when Ray said that and I remembered, we rushed to the laptop to access the camera footage. When we played it, we saw Ruth get out of her car and grab the kids. Then she marched them up to our door, and that's when something crazy happened. One of the kids tried to shake her off and make a run for it back to the car, but she grabbed him real quick once more and proceeded to shake him violently. It was the younger kid who'd tried to run, and when the older sibling saw him being shaken, he tried to tell Ruth to stop, but she turned around and slapped the older kid on the cheek. I gasped because the slap even looked like it had hurt, and it finally made sense that they were cowering in fear when they saw Ruth in the house once more when she came by to argue with us. Ray was just as shocked as I was, and we realized that the reason that the kids hadn't been speaking had probably also been because of Ruth. She'd instructed them not to talk, and that's why they'd kept to themselves. We realized immediately that something fishy was going on and wanted to call the cops or CPS, but the kids' terrified faces when we mentioned them the previous day were haunting us, so we didn't. Instead, we called a friend of ours who was a cop and informed him about what was going on, and he's the one who advised us to post the security footage on our social media. For one, it would help us prove that it was Ruth who'd brought the kids along with her. And secondly, the kids were definitely not ours, but whoever's kids these were, they might be looking for them. Ruth wasn't a kidnapper, and she definitely would not have abducted 2 kids, and if she'd taken these kids away from someone and they'd given them up, it meant that their real parents were definitely scared of the law and were up to something fishy. So we decided to go ahead and post the security footage with no hopes except that at least this would help us prove ourselves innocent. Prove me to be innocent, to be more precise, because Ruth had intended to get me into trouble over this. Ray and I posted the clip of Ruth marching the kids to our doorstep, and within hours, it had received several comments from our known ones. My brother-in-law was the first to apologize to us, but Ray's dad remained on Ruth's side and didn't say anything. Ruth herself didn't say anything except that we needed to take that video down or she'd sue us for defamation. We told her to bring it on because we weren't scared, but she hasn't done anything so far. The kids have been alright. They've told us their names but refused to answer any other questions we asked them about their past, their family, or their real parents. We haven't heard from anyone else for the past couple of days, but yesterday, my father-in-law finally called. Ray and I had assumed that he was calling to apologize, but when we answered, he was screaming at us for ruining his marriage and that we were the reason he was going to have to get divorced at his age. Neither of us had any idea what he was talking about, so we called Ray's brother instead, who told us that after we posted the clip online, Ruth and Ray's dad had been fighting like cats and dogs every single day, and things had finally come to a head yesterday when Ruth and her husband had yet another fight, at the end of which, Ruth told him that she wanted a divorce now. She'd even left the house and gone somewhere else to stay for a while, but hadn't told anyone where she was. Now my father-in-law was pissed at us for some reason because he thinks that us posting the footage is what led to all these fights. Ida for posting the footage of my mother-in-law dropping 2 unknown kids at my doorstep after she accused me of cheating and said those kids were mine. Update 1. Hey, everyone. So big update here. We finally found out who these kids really are and why exactly my in-laws are getting divorced. It's crazy for Ray and I right now, and I'm hoping saying this out loud might help me make sense of things. So the kids are technically Ruth's grandkids, but just not the way we thought they'd be. Apparently, Ruth had an affair a couple of years into her marriage and ended up getting pregnant too. Right after the baby was born, she got a paternity test done and it turned out to be her affair partner's baby. So she talked her husband into giving the child up for adoption because she said she wasn't willing to raise a third, after Ray and his brother, child. Now that she was almost 30, she was 28 at the time. My father-in-law wasn't happy about it, but he gave in to Ruth's demands because he believed that since she was the Psalm, she'd be the one having to deal with the kid the most, and if she wasn't ready then it was probably the best thing for them to give the child up for adoption. So Ruth manipulated her husband into letting her affair partner adopt their daughter when she was 6 months old without even him knowing about it. She'd continued to see her partner until his demise from a sudden stroke 2 years ago and had been cheating on her husband for more than the last 28 years. She'd also kept in touch with her daughter, and that's whose kids these were, aged 5 and 7. That's also why the kids looked so familiar, because they had the same dark hair and eyes that my mother-in-law and her daughter had also inherited from her. Her daughter had never been married and had both these kids with her boyfriend, but her boyfriend had dumped her about 2 months ago and now, she was struggling to make ends meet. Unfortunately, Ruth's daughter had a drug problem and so did her boyfriend, so her grandkids had grown up in fear of anything to do with the law and recognized the word CPS or cops very well because of the fear they associated it with, thanks to Ruth's threats whenever she would visit her daughter. Ruth would constantly threaten to call CPS on them and have their kids taken away, but her daughter and her boyfriend would beg her not to do anything of the sort and managed to evade it every time, and they'd even train their kids to run to the other room and cry whenever she would say those words, which is something we'd personally witnessed the other day. However, after her breakup, her daughter's drug problem had become worse due to grief and she was barely functioning anymore. She could neither take care of herself nor of her kids and had stopped going to work for weeks. She worked at the local grocery store, but she'd been fired from that job and barely had any money left. Ruth realized that she couldn't just leave her grandkids to suffer with her daughter, so she brought them and dumped them onto me and Ray last week, then dropped her daughter off at rehab. She'd finally had to confess the truth to her husband because she'd taken up the responsibility to pay for her daughter's treatment in rehab, and because she had no money of her own, she'd have to rely on her husband's. After she told him the truth, they got into a fight where apparently, Ray's dad said a lot of things. After that, she told him that he wouldn't have to bother about the money, she'd arranged for it herself and that she wanted a divorce now, then left the house and has been living with Ray's older brother since then. We didn't know her whereabouts so far because she'd made him promise not to tell anyone because she didn't want her husband to find out just yet. She was really distraught and has been in a very emotionally fragile state ever since she showed up at their house. It's been almost 4 days since she's been living with them and they've been lying to Ray's dad because they don't want him to find out. Ruth has told them the truth as well, which is how we found out because Ray's brother finally broke up today and ended up telling us the truth about the kids and even showed us pictures to prove it. My father-in-law has been miserable ever since Ruth left and Ray has been visiting him every day to make sure he's alright. The kids are still with me and they're doing a lot better but still refuse to talk about their parents, which now I understand. It sucks for them, but I've decided to take care of them until their mother is out of rehab, or at least they have a better place to go to. Update 2. So it's been 2 weeks since my original post and my in-laws decided to get back together today officially. The divorce is off now. They made up a few days ago when Ray's dad went over to visit his older son to ask if they'd been in touch with Ruth and found her there. They talked about everything and Ruth convinced him that she'd only loved the other guy, her affair partner, in the initial years, but after that, her life had been all about her husband. She'd only been in touch with him because of their daughter and no other reason, and he believes her. He's decided to give her another chance and work on their marriage for real this time. I don't know what they're thinking, but as long as they're alright, it's not any of my business. Ray doesn't know how to feel about any of this either, but I've convinced him not to talk to his parents about any of this. They're grown adults and can do whatever they want with their lives. It's really none of our business. Most importantly, Ruth is not someone I trust or like, so I think the less we interact with her, the better it is for Ray and me right now. As for the kids, Ray's brother has decided that they'll take them in because I'm going to have to go back to work full time from next week. I'm a teacher, so I had a couple weeks off for the summer, but I can't permanently keep the kids with me. Ray and I will kind of miss them because even though they refused to talk about their parents, they were quite open with us about other things and would be chattering away all day either with us or amongst themselves. They were a lot more open with us now since they arrived first, and we're happy about that because it means they felt safe with us. I trust Ray's brother. They're good people but a little too naive for their own good. I've made them promise not to leave the kids alone around Ruth, and they agree because the way she lost her temper with the kids the day she dropped them off at my place was scary to watch, and had their biological mother been around to take care of them, she probably would have called the cops on Ruth for the way she'd been treating those kids. We've been trying to familiarize the kids with Ray's brother and his wife for a while before they move in with them, and it's going well so far. So we hope that it continues even after they move out. Update 3. Hey, everyone. The kids have been living with my brother-in-law and his wife for a week now and they're doing relatively well. They've started going to the public school nearby, too, and are a lot happier and more bubbly than when they first arrived. My sister-in-law was a stay-at-home wife before, so she's also quite happy with this new arrangement. Ray and I have been in no contact with Ruth ever since the day she dropped the kids off at my place and accused me of being a cheater when she'd been the actual cheater all along. We can forgive the cheating, but we cannot forgive the very intentional attempt to ruin my marriage and dump her grandkids onto me. She could have gone to my brother-in-law if she really cared about the kids, but she cared more about ruining my image and marriage, so she came to me first. I'm lucky that Ray is a trusting husband and a good man who didn't just believe his mother blindly while she was saying all those things about me, and that's why our marriage is still working, because otherwise, we probably would have broken up by now. Ray has kept in touch with his dad and he's not very happy that his parents have chosen to stay together in spite of Ruth's infidelity, but it's their choice and he has to respect it. Mostly because I don't want him to intervene in their relationship. He's very upset with whatever Ruth has done and thinks that she's definitely the worst mother in the world right now who somehow managed to fail all 3 of her grown-up children, and I agree with him, but I don't want him to confront her about it. I just don't want to talk to her, see her, or hear from her ever again. She's a nasty piece of work who's tried to ruin my relationship with my husband and in-laws once already, and I'm not about to let her do that once again. My father-in-law has since apologized to me for not believing in me when Ruth made up that story about me and for blaming Ray and me for posting the footage of Ruth mistreating the children, but I don't buy it. I don't think someone can just change their mind overnight, and I don't want anything to do with him either. Ray can keep in touch with him, but I don't think I'll be attending any holiday parties hosted by my in-laws anytime soon. Update 4. So, it's been a little over 3 months and my half-sister-in-law, Ruth's other daughter, was finally released from rehab 2 weeks ago. My brother-in-law and his wife have continued to foster the kids and will do so for the foreseeable future because Ruth's other daughter is still not completely fit to raise 2 kids on her own just yet. She's living with Ruth and my father-in-law, which is crazy to me because the man is literally living with his wife's affair partner's daughter. I'm not as large-hearted and forgiving as that, or maybe I just have too much of a spine to forgive a cheater. It's ridiculous to me, but hey, if it works for them then it works for them. We still haven't talked to them and we definitely won't in the future either because Ruth is just a garbage person and we're sticking to our decision to cut her off. She's tried several times to reach out to Ray again, but my husband loves me too much to even consider speaking to that woman again, and I love him for that. Ray's also been telling me that the kids are probably going to get adopted by his brother soon enough because they've grown too attached to the kids, and since their father doesn't want them anymore and their mother isn't capable of raising them, it'll probably be easier for them to get custody as well. They haven't done anything yet legally, but I really hope they do get custody of the kids because as far as I'm concerned, that's the best thing that can happen to those kids.